Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kyle Schneps. I'm Vice President of Public Policy at Foundry. Uh, Foundry is a company that empowers decentralized infrastructure for the Bitcoin mining and larger crypto industry. Um, I'm here today as a co-author and co-editor of a book called National Security in the Digital Age, Bitcoin as a Tool for Modern Statecraft. This book was published just recently. We'll try to get you guys a copy afterwards if you want to have a little quick chat on it. Um, the point of the book is to serve as reference material for the policy community on why Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and the Bitcoin network at large is a net positive for global security and for statecrafts as governments consider embracing this technology, hopefully. So with that, I have my co-authors here and start at the end with Ben, and maybe they can introduce themselves to you.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here. Ben Kincaid. I spent years as a U.S. diplomat, left government service 2 years ago, spent the better part of that career serving in Africa, a career in the foreign field. Left government, started a Bitcoin mining company focused on Africa with the thesis of mining using stranded hydroelectric energy in Africa. I'm also CEO of ReElement Africa, which is a critical minerals refining company based out of Indiana. We have an international business as well, which is why I came on to help lead that. And it's been fascinating to see some of the corollaries between traditional mining and Bitcoin mining, which actually do very much exist. And it was just an absolute pleasure to collaborate with this team to highlight how Bitcoin really and increasingly so intersects with some core U.S. national security interests.
Excellent. Can you hear me? Excellent. So Matthew Pines, I'm the Director of Intelligence at Sentinel One's Strategic Advisory Group, where I advise multinationals and critical technology companies at the intersection of geopolitical and cybersecurity risks. That's my day job. The other hat I've worn for a few years now is as the National Security Fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I write about the intersection of Bitcoin, national security, geopolitics, advise some policymakers on those emerging issues. My chapter in the book was a Bitcoin and great power network competition. So trying to think about the role that Bitcoin could play as it emerges as a geopolitically relevant asset, as nation states are competing over kind of the digital technological kind of substrate of civilization. So cloud infrastructure, computing, and money are all going to be kind of the battlegrounds as Cold War 2.0 kind of continues to heat up.
Hi, my name is Pierre Rard. I'm the Vice President of Research at Riot Platforms. Riot owns and operates approximately or more than 20 exahash in the state of Texas, which is about 800 megawatts of power draw. We're one of the largest publicly traded Bitcoin miners. So my chapter co-authored with the president of the Texas Blockchain Council, Lee Bratcher. We wrote a chapter about how Bitcoin mining interacts with the grid, especially in the context of the Texas grid, ERCOT. Lee Bratcher, he's a captain in the Texas National Guard. And myself, I'm a civilian, but I do have experience in psychological warfare on social media. That's about the extent of it. And we wanted to focus on how Bitcoin balances the grid, and as a tool to help for anybody who is either interested in joining the mining industry and kind of understanding the dynamics there, but also for policymakers who are trying to understand, okay, is Bitcoin mining destabilizing the grid or is it actually beneficial?
All right. So let's kick off with a few questions around this topic. So let's start with Matt. Matt, we all know that Bitcoin is a decentralized protocol that is controlled by no government. From a geopolitical perspective, then, if the U.S. can't control Bitcoin, how can it still gain an advantage by embracing it?
Yeah, so this is where, the question for all the marbles comes in. And I think the way to first frame that is thinking about the two critical aspects of Bitcoin, both as a global decentralized settlement system, and as well as, the other Bitcoin, which is the hard commodity-like digital gold asset. And I think both of those aspects of, Bitcoin considered broadly are going to have a role to play in that geopolitical competition that I was framing out. And both on just take the first piece of it, as a global decentralized network for financial settlement, it sort of offers kind of a novel aspect of kind of a 21st century version of kind of the global clearing and settlement systems that we're currently kind of fighting over, right? So there's the legacy U.S. sort of dominated CHIPS and SWIFT clearing systems, which have been like increasingly politicized and geopoliticized, and became the instruments through which the U.S. was able to exert some international pressure and coerce, smaller powers to, align with its foreign policy objectives. I think, the U.S. government has realized there's certain limits to the ability to wield that kind of a choke point sort of sanction weapon. And so other countries are building kind of their own alternative systems now. So China is sort of rolling out their competing alternative, sort of a backup system called SIPs, which is designed to essentially provide that resilience, right? So our adversaries are trying to construct their own sanction-resistant kind of peer-to-peer settlement systems, mainly premised on sort of this cross-border CBDC sorts of arrangements. And that comes with their much more sort of authoritarian inclined visions of governance. And there's lots of willing subscribers to that kind of authoritarianism as a service model in the global south. Meanwhile, Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins are kind of being organically adopted as a means of peer-to-peer global settlement by citizens in those very same countries that were sort of trying to compete for influence and try to pull them into kind of a 21st century global digital economy. And so there's kind of a competition of visions here, whether it's going to be a CBDC top-down, much more kind of Eastern-oriented sort of technological network, or it's going to be this more open, organic global system that is aligned, at least in theory, with Western values, right, or liberal values more generally. The idea that you can own and custody your own assets, you can exchange those assets for goods and services without a potentially corrupt or extractive intermediary. And so, to the extent the United States wants to push those values and wants to see parts of the global South brought into a global economy in a way that respects their aspirations, Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins are kind of aligned with that effort. And then there's a whole separate sort of bucket of analysis, which is on Bitcoin as a hard asset, Bitcoin as a sort of form of digital gold. As we see, lots of indebted sovereigns, not just in the West, but globally, essentially confront the limits of fiscal capacity. As we've come out of COVID and war have disrupted kind of most global balance sheets. And the major solution to that in history is essentially to print money. And so you've seen most savvy investors sort of flee into hard assets. It could be NVIDIA stock, it could be gold, it could be Bitcoin. And so I think Bitcoin, to the extent that if we're heading into this era of increased sort of fiscal dominance or debt monetization, we as Americans, we can think about that accruing disproportionately to gold. In which case, mostly that would stand to relatively benefit Russia, China, Iran, et cetera, those who have been stockpiling gold. So if we can redirect some of that, that sort of global liquidity that's going to be monetized over the next 5 or 10 years, if that marginally shifts into digital gold, Bitcoin, well, that would stand to gain relative to our adversaries, right? Mostly, individuals in the West as well as around the world that hold Bitcoin as a sovereign reserve asset could find themselves, getting the benefit of this, essentially a reserve asset for the people as opposed to a relatively more difficult to access asset in the West.
I want to expand on some of the things you said. So you mentioned organic adoption, and this may be a good question for Ben. You mentioned sort of organic adoption and the global South specifically. Ben, you and I have spent a lot of time living and working in Africa. I know you've spent a lot of time analyzing it. What role does Bitcoin have to play in real development in Africa, and not sort of the NGO type of development that sometimes is not as real?
Yeah. I neglected to mention that my chapter was on Bitcoin and Africa and where that touches U.S. national security interests. I mentioned that I spent a lot of time working and living in Africa, primarily in the parts of Africa that have, unfortunately, over the last decades, kind of gone through cycles of violence, coup d'etats, unstable regime after unstable regime, stabilized only by, in many cases, the colonial powers from which these countries kind of arose. So primarily Western Africa, Francophone countries. So there's kind of two things that when I was serving, I noticed, but it wasn't until I dropped down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, which forced a kind of closer look at the macroeconomic picture and the kind of the structural reasons behind some of these problems and failings, that a lot of well-intentioned money and development support from both public, state and private organizations just has not been able to resolve. And that is, something that Matt spoke to, which is throwing good money after bad, that generally gets funneled to the corporate and political elite of these countries, captures most of it, and then they dole out what they think is kind of absolutely necessary to kind of maintain control over their populations. And one of the reasons for that is that in Africa in particular, most countries in Africa, a lot of countries in Africa, at the individual level, there's very, very limited opportunities for financial sovereignty. Most of Africa, I think an overwhelming majority of Africans and a lot of West Africa are unbanked. Some don't have identities, and so don't have any real opportunity to connect themselves to financial instruments that allow themselves to raise themselves out of their poverty, and their situation, and kind of grow a middle class. So it's definitely early days, but I would say a review of the last 5 years shows pretty incontrovertibly that Africans are turning to kind of a disintermediated opportunity for financial representation like Bitcoin, and because it gives them something that they just simply did not have before, even as a volatile asset, and that's to bank themselves. And so I think that there's an element of how Bitcoin has, I think, continues to, and I will see more of it, increase financial sovereignty at the individual level, which is, I think, really what is needed as a base layer of a society that has some upward mobility. So that's one, and then and we're seeing that organically. This is not something that is forced down from the state or forced down from third states. Something that people are finding themselves, for all of the reasons I think everyone in this room understands about how an open protocol cryptocurrency like Bitcoin can provide. And then I think, and we can maybe round back to it later, it also, especially in Africa, I think, provides an opportunity to increase national sovereignty, where there has been, just a lot of difficulty. And so, name your great power actor that has gone to the continent for resource exploitation and worked with corrupt foreign leaders to mine what comes out of the ground, or provide not particularly favorable debt to provide infrastructure that's needed, but traps a lot of these countries and their leadership into a cycle of dependency at that state level. And so when you look at Bitcoin mining as an opportunity for these countries to really take advantage of a massive natural resource that they have, in some places more than others, which is energy, and to be able to finance the development of infrastructure and also gain revenue from energy as a sovereign that does not have to go offshore, that's going to be very, very powerful. And I speak to kind of the need for a Westphalia 2.0 in Africa that I think Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining is enabling on the continent.
I think there's a lot of there's certainly a lot to focus on there in terms of making most use of your abundant natural resource there, which is energy. But I think that one thing the book does is not only discuss in a global perspective that concept, but also brings it back domestically to the U.S. And that's kind of where, Pierre, you focus a lot of your research on for the past decade, has been in that sort of energy realm. And so when it comes to national security, one of the biggest buzzwords we hear, and probably a legitimate one, I would say, in current political discourse, is the idea of energy security. And so I was wondering, would love to get some of your thoughts on how Bitcoin can interplay with energy security for the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see Bitcoin mining as really being strategically important for the U.S. from a national security perspective along two axes. The first is about depriving foreign adversaries of hard currency revenue. So we know that Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and others, North Korea, who are not aligned with the values we have, we know that they're mining Bitcoin because it's permissionless, and there are press reports of it. And there are also rumors about how much of mining rigs they're importing into their countries. So the basic point is that the more Bitcoin we mine here in the United States, the less Bitcoin they can mine abroad, and then they won't have the resources to implement the evil, dastardly deeds that they want to do. So that's one. The second is to your point about domestic energy security. And if we look at the history of energy policy in the U.S., if we go from the 70s, where, after the oil crisis, it was very focused on conservation and kind of scarcity and limiting ourselves and efficiency, to eventually evolving with the fracking revolution to be more towards abundance and energy dominance and energy independence here in the United States. And so while we have that on the oil and gas side, ultimately that has to be converted into electricity using natural gas power plants. So the U.S. can either export natural gas with LNG, and we've heard lots about that and how that's being built up, including on the Texas coast. But we can also convert that natural gas, which quite often is what we call associated gas. That is that Texas oil producers were getting expensive oil at $90 a barrel. And while they were drilling for that liquid oil, they got this gas as a byproduct. And so it's almost like a waste product that they want to get rid of. And that has driven down the price of natural gas quite a lot. So combined with the unique geography in Texas, but also in New Mexico and others, of tremendous solar potential and as well as wind potential, that's an area where whether it's due to just the economics of it or the subsidies on top of that, we've seen a massive growth of wind and solar in Texas. And when you plug in these resources onto the grid, the renewables are unfortunately intermittent, meaning that when the sun sets, solar power generation in Texas goes from 21 gigawatts to 0 gigawatts in the span of an hour. And so to offset that, what you have to pray for is for the wind to pick up in the evening. And usually it does, but sometimes you get a window where there's just not enough power generation.
And we've got lots of natural gas power plants that spin up to fill that gap. And increasingly in Texas, we have batteries. But what we found is that that's just not enough. And Bitcoin miners, because they are very price responsive, they turn off their Bitcoin mining facilities during that 1 hour window in the evening when the sun is setting in order to avert having any kind of scarcity conditions for electricity on the grid. So the Bitcoin mining as an integrated load on the grid, we always have to think about the fact that the grid is built to meet peak demand. And peak demand happens less than 1% of the year. And so that means that the rest of the year, that 99% of the time, the grid is overbuilt. It has excess capacity. That means that you can add a load to it at the margin, and it doesn't have any kind of negative effect on the system. In fact, it has a positive one of paying for it, right? That now you've got Bitcoin miners that are paying for this power generation, paying for this transmission, paying for reinvestment into these energy assets, which ultimately makes electricity less expensive for the rest of the economy. And it helps with energy security in that now you have a base load that is providing all this revenue and putting it towards domestic infrastructure rather than giving it away to foreign adversaries who would go and buy weapons with it.
Yeah, there's so much there, and we appreciate all the work you've done over the years, and certainly you can read all about those ideas in the chapter, like you mentioned, that you wrote with Lee Bratcher. We've got 5 or 6 minutes left, so I want to ask a question that we can kind of pass down the row here. So the question is, magic wand scenario, you're able to change one thing that the U.S. government changes in its approach toward Bitcoin mining, toward the network. What would you most like to see the U.S. government change in its approach to Bitcoin in this digital age that we talk to so much in the book? You want to start here?
I'll start. I think that we're in a pretty good spot on the Bitcoin mining side. So I feel like a lot of our battles are about not changing something. But then on the transactional side of Bitcoin, I think that a huge change that would be really improve the user experience with Bitcoin is a de minimis tax exemption, where if you're spending less than $500 worth of Bitcoin, you shouldn't have to go through the paperwork of figuring out what your capital gain or loss was on it, and that we should actually be encouraging the use of Bitcoin at point of sale in commerce so that people are not captured by Visa or MasterCard and these oligopolies that are gouging people on transaction fees. And we've seen a lot of folks on Capitol Hill complaining about these interchange fees and finding ways to lower them from a regulatory perspective. But I really believe in the power of competition. And so we've just got to level the playing field between Bitcoin and Lightning and Visa and the dollar, and that we'll see what consumers want in the marketplace.
Matt?
I would say one is a bit like tactical, right? In the sense of doing nothing to harm self-custody, right? So it's like not what they should do, so what they shouldn't do, right? So just keep your hands off self-custody. More proactively though, getting back to the theme of the book, which is about statecraft. So statecraft is about the intelligent and strategic use and and design of all the instruments of national power in service of a long-term vision of national and economic security. So it's not just fighting whatever immediate battles, not trying to put out fires or being reactive to events in the world, and also not just looking in the rearview mirror, but actually having a long-term forward-thinking vision that takes into account your goals for your population and their economic and national security, as well as like what you think the other actors in the global system are going to do. And that means you have to pull together many different disciplines, many different arms and legs of the government into a cohesive and intelligent, organized effort. And that's what I would call for, essentially, is a cohesive and organized national level effort to actually study and come up with a national strategic plan to take advantage of Bitcoin, right? Doesn't mean
We're still talking about the U.S. government, right?
the U.S. government. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, again, but the legacy folks inside the U.S. government that usually get tapped to join a working group or a task force or to help review the memo or whatever, especially if something's blowing up on a Friday night. It's going to be the person who has the longest amount of experience. And the U.S. government, those are the folks that had spent, the early years fighting, sort of cyber criminals, right, and Silk Road. And so they're like latent mental models is it's a bad thing used by bad people to do bad things. And that sort of mental attitude is sort of hard to dislodge, and it's sort of implanted in a few key parts of the U.S. government apparatus. But there are lots of other people representing many different parts of the government, including the traditional defense and intelligence and international aid and development, that have not really been involved in those sorts of conversations internally. And I think you want to bring a wider swath of perspectives and actually have a coherent, long-term strategy that you want to mitigate the risks. Nothing is free, but actually try to intelligently take advantage of those opportunities.
Ben.
So real quick on the domestic side, I would say, independent of your politics, watch RFK's speech, Bitcoin Nashville. I think that's the direction we should be going. But to take it back to the international side and how we can be supportive of our policies that affect our bilateral relationships as geopolitical tensions continue to rise at the same time that we have less budget to be able to spend and outcompete the Chinese and others in kind of core fronts in Cold War 2.0, Africa kind of being at the center of that. And I would say one thing is that I believe we're going through a renaissance and transition where Cold War 1.0 was defined mostly by the government attracting the best and the brightest to come inside and be a part of the Manhattan Project and a number of other initiatives that created the innovation and the competitiveness that we needed to come out the other side the way that we did. That structure has simply changed, and I think everyone sees the rise of both big and little tech being essential to our competitiveness, not just at home but overseas. And so when I was a diplomat in a few places, I had a lot of very similar conversations, which were, of course, we want to work more closely with the United States than with China or Russia or other countries, Turkey. But they're here, they're building, they're working with us, they're doing it without a fuss, and you guys are not. I think that we can change that on multiple fronts across multiple industries. I'm seeing that, for example, in the critical minerals industry. But with Bitcoin, I would say working with the USAIDs and our Commerce Department that promotes U.S. businesses and competitiveness overseas to do things the right way in partnership with, for example, African nations to create win-win situations, but with real market wins at their back so that, for example, a major project does not depend on endless subsidies in order to be successful, because that is simply not the way the world works and does not work within the American context. So I think America meeting these countries where they are, helping them to unlock their resources, add value to those resources, energy and Bitcoin mining being one in the Africa context, and otherwise helps to stabilize those countries, helps to create real and lasting friendships, pushes back on authoritarian competition, namely China, and will allow U.S. companies to be at the forefront to grow and to stay in those countries in partnership with nations that want to really extract real value for their people and unlock industrial development.
There you go. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'd like to thank Foundry for sponsoring the panel. And please do check us out at PubKey tonight. We're going to be doing another event, and stop by our, we have a book signing thing over here. Get yourself a book, and appreciate everybody who helped at Mainnet here as well.
Thank you.